A homeless SEAL opened a hidden bunker in his dead father's ranger station. Then armed men came for his dog. Freezing rain hammered the windshield of Mason Reed's dying pickup truck outside a Montana truck stop the night the letter arrived. At 24, the former Navy SEAL had nothing left except Ghost, the scarred military K-9 who refused to abandon him after war destroyed everything else. But deep in the Idaho mountains, an old ranger station waited in silence, along with a secret powerful men were willing to kill for. Comment 1 if you'd protect your dog no matter what, or 0 if you think Mason should have walked away, and tell me where you're watching from. I remember the sound first. Not the rain, not the trucks growling through the darkness on Interstate 90, not even Ghost breathing beside me in the cab. I remember the sound of my own heartbeat waking me from another nightmare. Fast, violent, trapped. For 1 second I thought I was back in Syria. Smoke, gunfire, a little girl screaming behind a concrete wall. Then the cold found me again. Montana cold. April rain hammering the rusted roof of my pickup like handfuls of nails. I opened my eyes slowly. The windshield was fogged white from our breath. Water leaked through a crack near the passenger side visor and dripped steadily into an empty coffee cup balanced on the dashboard. Outside, truck stoplights glowed pale yellow through the storm, turning the wet pavement into pools of smeared gold. Ghost lifted his head from the torn blanket between the seats. The old German shepherd looked at me without moving. Waiting. Always waiting. "You're good," I muttered. My voice sounded rough from sleep and too many nights spent talking to nobody. Ghost lowered his head again, but his ears stayed alert. That dog never really slept anymore. Neither did I. I rubbed both hands over my face and stared through the windshield at the line of semis parked beside the fuel pumps. Diesel smoke drifted through the rain. Somewhere out there, a country song crackled faintly from a truck radio before vanishing beneath the storm. 3 months earlier, I had been sleeping in military barracks. Now I was 24 years old, homeless, broke, and living out of a pickup that smelled like wet dog, gun oil, and old coffee. Funny how fast a life could collapse. I reached for the plastic grocery bag hanging from the gear shift and checked what was left. Half a loaf of bread, 2 protein bars, 1 can of beef stew, $38 and some change. Ghost watched me quietly while I counted it. He always watched me when I counted money, like he understood. Maybe he did. Combat dogs learned people better than people learned themselves. I scratched the scar behind his left ear. "You hungry?" His tail thumped once against the seat. I split the last protein bar in half and handed him the bigger piece. Outside, thunder rolled low across the mountains. The storm had settled over western Montana 3 days earlier and never really left. Everything smelled wet now. Wet asphalt, wet pine trees, wet clothes that never fully dried. Even the sky looked exhausted. I opened the truck door and cold rain slapped me across the face instantly. The truck stop sat 30 miles outside Missoula near the edge of the mountains, surrounded by dark pines and muddy fields still carrying patches of dirty snow. The neon sign above the diner buzzed weakly through the rain. Mabel's Truck Haven. Half the letters flickered. Kind of fitting. I pulled my hood up and crossed the parking lot toward the restroom building while Ghost trotted beside me. His paws splashed through shallow puddles, claws clicking softly whenever we crossed concrete. People stared at him. They always did. Partly because he was big, mostly because of the scars. A long white mark cut across his muzzle. Another appeared beneath the fur near his ribs where shrapnel had torn into him outside Raqqa. His left ear had a notch missing from an explosion that killed 2 Marines 20 feet away from us. Ghost noticed people watching, but he ignored them. Military dogs learn discipline better than most soldiers. Inside the restroom, fluorescent lights hummed overhead. I splashed cold water across my face and stared at the mirror. I barely recognized myself anymore. My hair had grown too long. Dark circles sat beneath my eyes like bruises. The beard made me look older than 24. Tired older. The kind of tired that sleep never fixed. For a second, the mirror shifted. Not really. Just my head. But suddenly the reflection became another face. Blood on concrete. A terrified civilian woman screaming while smoke swallowed the alley behind her. My chest tightened instantly. I gripped the sink hard. Not here. Not now. Breathe. Ghost stepped closer immediately. One nudge against my leg. Solid. Grounding. Real. I focused on the weight of his body beside mine until the panic loosened enough for air to come back into my lungs. "That's it," I whispered. His amber eyes never left mine. A trucker entering the restroom stopped when he saw us. "You okay, buddy?" "Yeah." The lie came automatically. The trucker nodded uncertainly and moved on. Everybody asks. Nobody wants the real answer. I stepped back outside into the rain. The storm had gotten worse. Wind bent the pine trees along the highway, while freezing rain rattled against the parked trucks. Ghost suddenly stopped walking and looked toward the road. A county sheriff's SUV rolled slowly into the truck stop lot. I felt my stomach tighten immediately. Experience. When you're homeless, police cars usually mean trouble. The SUV parked beside my truck. Ghost stood quietly beside me, alert but controlled. The sheriff climbing out looked about 60, thick gray mustache, heavy shoulders stuffed into a rain jacket. He glanced at Ghost first, then at me. "You Mason Reed?" I nodded slowly. "Depends who's asking." He gave a tired half smile. "Sheriff Donnelly, Missoula County." He pulled a large envelope from beneath his jacket to keep it dry. "Been trying to track you down for 2 weeks." I stared at the envelope. Cream-colored. Official. My full name typed neatly across the front. Mason Daniel Reed. Nobody used my middle name anymore. Something about seeing it there unsettled me. "You got family in Idaho?" the sheriff asked. "No." "You sure?" "Pretty sure I'd know." He handed me the envelope anyway. Certified delivery. Lawyer paid extra to make sure it reached you personally. Rain hammered the parking lot around us. Ghost pressed against my leg. I looked at the return address. Mercer and Halbrook legal offices. Blackwater Ridge, Idaho. Never heard of it. "Probably some mistake," I said. "Maybe." The sheriff studied me for another second. Then his eyes shifted toward Ghost. "Beautiful dog. Retired military." "Thought so." The old sheriff crouched slightly and let Ghost sniff his hand. Ghost allowed it. That surprised me. Animals knew people better than humans did. The sheriff stood again. "Well," he said quietly, "whatever's in that envelope, somebody spent a lot of time looking for you." Then he tipped his hat and walked back through the rain toward his SUV. I stood there watching the taillights disappear into the storm. The envelope felt strangely heavy in my hands, like opening it might change something I wasn't ready to change. Ghost nudged my elbow. I looked down at him. You think it's bad news? His ears twitched. Helpful as always. Back inside the truck, rain drummed against the roof while I tore the envelope open carefully. Several documents slid into my lap. Legal forms, property transfer paperwork, a typed letter on thick white paper. I started reading. Dear Mr. Reed, you are hereby notified that upon the passing of Evelyn Grace Mercer on February 11th, 2026, you have been named sole beneficiary to the Mercer Ranger Station property located in Bitterroot Valley, near Blackwater Ridge, Idaho. The property consists of 1 ranger residence, 48 acres of surrounding wilderness land, 1 decommissioned fire lookout tower, associated structures and access rights per Ms. Mercer's final instructions. The property transfer is contingent upon your personal arrival within 30 days of receipt of this notice. Failure to appear may result in forfeiture of inheritance rights. I frowned. I had never heard the name Evelyn Mercer in my life. The rain outside seemed louder now. I kept reading. Ms. Mercer left additional instructions to be delivered directly to you upon arrival. There was one final line typed separately beneath the signature. 1 sentence. Short, cold, almost like a warning. The dog must remain with you at all times. I read it twice, then a third time. Beside me, Ghost lifted his head slowly, and for the first time in months, I felt something stronger than exhaustion. Curiosity. Outside, thunder rolled through the Montana mountains while freezing rain swept across the truck stop windows. And somewhere far south beyond those dark highways and pine-covered ridges, an old ranger station waited for a man and a dog who had nowhere left to go. I looked at Ghost. You ever heard of Evelyn Mercer? He stared back at me silently. Then, very slowly, the old war dog rested his head on my knee, like he already knew the answer. I didn't sleep much after that. The rain kept hammering the truck through the rest of the night, while Ghost stayed awake in the passenger seat, watching the highway through the fogged glass. Every couple hours, headlights swept across the cab, flashing silver through the darkness before disappearing back into the storm. I read the letter 4 more times before dawn. 48 acres. A ranger station. A woman named Evelyn Mercer. And one sentence that kept crawling through my head like a splinter. The dog must remain with you at all times. Not requested, not suggested, required. By morning, the rain had turned into wet snow drifting sideways across the truck stop lot. The mountains beyond the interstate were hidden behind thick gray clouds, but I could feel them out there. Huge, silent, waiting. Ghost was already alert before I opened my eyes fully. He sat upright in the passenger seat, staring south toward the highway. You ready to go? His tail thumped once against the torn upholstery. That was answer enough. I spent the last of my truck's stop money on bad coffee, 2 breakfast sandwiches, and a full tank of gas that barely climbed above half. The cashier, a woman maybe my mother's age with tired eyes and nicotine-stained fingers, watched Ghost carefully while I paid. Military dog? She asked quietly. Yeah. He looks smart. He's smarter than me. That got the faintest smile out of her. When I turned toward the door, she stopped me. You heading into the mountains? Idaho. Storm's getting worse up there. I nodded. Everything was getting worse somewhere. Outside, Ghost jumped into the truck while snow hissed against the windshield. The engine coughed twice before finally turning over with a sound like old bones grinding together. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. I could still leave. I could throw the letter away, drive south, find another truck stop, another parking lot. Another week pretending I still had a plan. But deep down, I already knew I was going, because hopeless men will follow even the smallest possibility of being wanted somewhere, even into the mountains. The interstate carried us west through dark forests and frozen valleys, where rivers moved beneath sheets of cracked ice. Snow gathered along the shoulders of the highway, in dirty gray piles, while logging trucks thundered past, spraying slush across my windshield. Ghost never relaxed. Usually he slept during long drives, stretched across the bench seat with one eye half open, like every combat dog I'd ever worked beside. Not today. Today he watched the road constantly, especially whenever we passed old Forest Service roads disappearing into the trees. Twice he growled low in his throat at empty stretches of pine forest. "You seeing ghosts now too?" I muttered. His ears stayed pinned forward. The farther south we drove, the more the world changed. Missoula disappeared behind us. Then the chain stores vanished. Then gas stations became fewer and farther apart. The mountains rose higher on both sides of the highway, dark blue beneath storm clouds heavy enough to crush the sky. By late afternoon, my phone had no signal. That should have bothered me. Instead, it felt strangely peaceful, like the world was slowly losing track of me. The snowstorm worsened near the Idaho border. Wind shoved the truck sideways across patches of black ice while tall pines bent and groaned above the road. The heater barely worked anymore. Cold air leaked through the doors no matter how high I turned the fan. Ghost climbed into the space beside me and leaned his weight against my leg, grounding me, always grounding me. I reached down and rubbed his neck absently while mile after mile of wilderness rolled past outside. Then the memories started again. Not full flashbacks, worse. Fragments. A little boy covered in concrete dust, radio chatter screaming through static. The smell of burned wiring, blood spreading beneath a doorway. I tightened my grip on the wheel. Breathe. Focus. Road. Trees. Snow. Ghost lifted his head instantly. He sensed it before I said anything. Combat dogs always know. His nose nudged my arm once. Solid. Real. Here. Not Syria. Not the alley. Not the fire. The panic loosened slowly. I exhaled hard. "You're earning your keep today." His tail brushed the seat once. By sunset, we reached a narrow two-lane road, cutting deeper into the Bitterroot wilderness. A rusted wooden sign leaned crooked beside the turnoff. Blackwater Ridge, 18 miles. The letters were faded nearly white from weather. The road beyond it disappeared into snow-covered forest. I hesitated. Ghost stared straight ahead, waiting. I turned onto the road. The truck's tires crunched through packed snow while darkness settled over the mountains around us. No streetlights. No houses. Just endless trees and occasional glimpses of steep cliffs dropping into black valleys below. The isolation hit me physically, like crossing an invisible line between the world I knew and someplace older, someplace quieter. Snow drifted through the headlights in silver waves. The road twisted upward for miles. Then suddenly, the trees opened, and I saw the town. Blackwater Ridge. Tiny. A handful of buildings tucked beneath towering mountains beside a frozen river. Warm yellow lights glowed in cabin windows while smoke curled from chimneys into the storm-dark sky. Population maybe 200, maybe less. It looked less like a town and more like something trying hard not to disappear. Ghost sat upright immediately, alert, focused. The farther we rolled into town, the stranger people looked at us. An old man fueling his truck stopped pumping gas entirely. Two women outside a feed store turned silently to watch us pass. A teenager shoveling snow outside a motel froze with both hands on the shovel handle. Nobody waved. Nobody smiled. It wasn't hostility exactly, more like recognition. That unsettled me worse. I spotted a diner near the center of town, its windows glowing gold against the storm. Mabel's place. Not the same Mabel, thankfully. I parked outside beneath a sagging neon sign while snow gathered on the hood immediately. You hungry? Ghost's ears perked. Thought so. The warmth hit us hard when we stepped inside. Coffee, frying bacon, wet wool jackets drying near a stove. The diner was small, maybe 8 booths total, with wood-paneled walls covered in old hunting photos and faded newspaper clippings about wildfires from decades earlier. Conversations stopped when we entered. Every head turned. Ghost stayed tight against my leg. An old waitress carrying a coffee pot approached slowly. She had silver hair braided down her back and the sharp mountain eyes of someone who noticed everything. No dogs, she started automatically. Then she saw Ghost's tactical harness, saw the scars, saw the old military tattoos barely visible beneath my sleeve. Something changed in her face. He service? Combat retired. She studied Ghost another second before nodding toward a booth. Sit wherever. I slid into the booth near the window while Ghost curled beneath the table. Snow drifted sideways outside under the streetlights. The waitress poured coffee carefully. You passing through? Maybe. Maybe usually means trouble around here. I almost smiled at that. Got a letter, I said finally. Says I inherited some property. That got the attention of half the diner immediately. The waitress stopped pouring. What property? Ranger Station. Mercer Place. The room went completely silent. Not normal silence. Heavy silence. Like everybody in the diner had suddenly remembered something unpleasant. The waitress looked toward the kitchen, then back at me. You Mason Reed? Cold moved slowly down my spine. Yeah. She set the coffee pot down carefully. For a second, I thought she might tell me to leave. Instead, she leaned closer. That station should have stayed empty. Before I could answer, Ghost's head snapped upward beneath the table. A low growl rolled from his chest. Every hair along his back stood up. The entire diner turned toward the windows. Outside, beyond the snow-covered street, a figure stood motionless near the tree line at the edge of town, watching us. Then lightning flashed across the mountains, and the figure vanished. The diner stayed silent for another 2 or 3 seconds after that. Not normal silence, the kind that presses against your ears. Ghost remained rigid beneath the table, staring toward the windows with every muscle tight beneath his scarred coat. A low growl still vibrated deep in his chest. The waitress slowly picked up the coffee pot again. Probably somebody heading home, she muttered. But she didn't sound like she believed it. Neither did anyone else. I looked back outside. Snow swirled across the empty street beneath the yellow glow of the streetlights. The tree line beyond town stood black and motionless against the storm. Nobody there now. Maybe there never had been. PTSD does funny things to your eyes at night. Still, Ghost didn't relax. That bothered me more than the figure itself. The waitress finally slid a plate of eggs and hash browns in front of me. Kitchen closes in 20 minutes, she said quietly. Eat while it's hot. I nodded. You got a motel around here? Only one. Ridgeway Lodge, 2 blocks east. She hesitated. You really heading up to the Mercer station tomorrow? That's the plan. A man at the counter snorted softly into his coffee. Road's damn near buried this time of year. Another voice answered from somewhere near the back booth. Station's been empty over a year anyway. Should have stayed that way. The waitress shot both men a sharp look that shut them up immediately. I ate slowly, while Ghost kept watch beneath the table. The diner smelled like coffee grounds, bacon grease and wet pine smoke drifting in every time the front door opened. Outside, the storm deepened over Blackwater Ridge until the whole town seemed trapped inside a snow globe. Somebody kept shaking harder. Finally, the waitress returned with the check. Then she surprised me by sitting down across from me in the booth. Up close, she looked older than I first thought. Late 60s, maybe. Weathered face, strong hands. Sharp gray eyes that had probably watched half the town grow old. You said your name's Mason Reed? Yeah. And the dog's Ghost. I frowned slightly. I never told you his name. That seemed to amuse her. Whole town knew before you parked the truck. How? Small places hear things fast. She studied me carefully. You got your father's eyes. The words hit me like cold water. My father died before I was born. That what your mama told you? I stared at her. The diner around us suddenly felt very far away. I hadn't heard anybody mention my mother in years. She died when I was 13, I said carefully. The woman nodded slowly. I know. Something tightened in my chest. Who are you? My name's Naomi Granger. She offered one rough-skinned hand across the table. I shook it automatically. The grip was firm. Mountain people always grip your hand like they mean it. Naomi glanced toward Ghost. He's military, all right. You can tell? I was married to a Marine for 32 years. What happened to him? Cancer. The answer came flat and simple. Old grief, settled grief. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a folded photograph worn soft around the edges. I think you should see this before you go up that mountain. She slid it across the table toward me. The photograph was old, maybe 20 years, faded around the corners. A woman stood in front of a ranger station, high in the mountains, beside a younger man, wearing desert camouflage. The woman looked about 60 then. Strong posture. Silver hair tied back beneath a ranger cap. Sharp eyes. Evelyn Mercer. I knew somehow immediately. But it wasn't her that froze me. It was the man beside her. Tall, dark hair, seal trident pinned above his pocket. One hand rested on the head of a German shepherd puppy sitting proudly beside him. The dog had the exact same white streak across its chest as Ghost. And the man had my face. Older maybe, harder, but unmistakably mine. I stopped breathing for a second. That's impossible, I whispered. Naomi watched me quietly. That picture was taken summer of 2004. I couldn't pull my eyes away from it. The man's hand rested protectively against the puppy's neck. The puppy looked straight into the camera. Alert, focused, fearless. Ghost slowly pushed his head into my lap beneath the table, like he understood exactly what I was looking at. Who is he? I asked, even though I already knew. Naomi's voice softened. Daniel Reed. The diner disappeared around me. The storm disappeared. Everything narrowed down to the photograph in my hands. My father. The man I'd spent my entire life believing walked away before I was born. The man my mother refused to talk about. The man I buried in my head years ago because dead fathers hurt less than abandoning ones. He was Navy? I asked quietly. SEAL. I laughed once under my breath. Not because anything was funny, because suddenly half my life made terrible sense. The nightmares, the silence, the way violence always came easier than peace. Naomi leaned back slowly. Your father came through Blackwater Ridge off and on for years. He knew Evelyn Mercer? Knew her? Naomi almost smiled. Honey, Evelyn practically raised him. I looked up sharply. What? She was his aunt. That hit me even harder. I had family. Real family. Not foster homes, not caseworkers, not temporary strangers pretending to care for a monthly check. Actual blood. And somehow I never knew any of it. Why didn't anybody tell me? Naomi sighed. That story's older and uglier than tonight. Outside the diner window, snow blew sideways beneath the streetlights. Ghost remained pressed against my leg, calm now, grounding me again. Naomi nodded toward the photograph. That puppy there? I swallowed. Yeah? His name was Valor. Ghost's ears twitched immediately beneath the table. Valor was your father's combat dog. Best tracking dog this valley ever saw. I looked down slowly at Ghost. The old shepherd lifted his eyes toward mine. Same amber color as the puppy in the picture. Same white chest streak. Same intelligent stillness. The bloodline, Naomi said softly. Military breeding program out of Virginia. Your father handled the original dog. Ghost comes from that same line. I stared at the photograph while something strange and painful moved through my chest. Not happiness exactly. Something more dangerous. Connection. I hadn't felt connected to another human being in years. Maybe ever. Naomi reached for the coffee pot and topped off my cup. She waited for you, you know. I looked up. Who? Evelyn. The storm rattled the diner windows harder. Naomi folded both hands around her mug. For years she asked if anybody had heard from Daniel's boy. My throat tightened unexpectedly. She knew about me? Knew your birthday, too. Naomi smiled faintly. Every year she donated money to veteran shelters over in Missoula under your father's name. Said one day, maybe the kindness would circle back around. I looked away quickly. The room blurred slightly for a second. Not now. Don't do this here. Not in front of strangers. But Naomi saw it anyway. Older women always do. She came close to finding you once, she said quietly. When? 3 years ago. I frowned. She drove to Missoula after hearing a homeless outreach worker mention a young veteran with a shepherd dog sleeping behind a rail yard. My chest tightened hard. That had been me. Winter after discharge, before the truck, before everything got worse. Naomi continued softly. She sat outside for almost 4 hours, waiting to see if it was you. Why didn't she talk to me? Naomi looked toward the storm-dark windows. She was afraid. Of what? That you'd hate her for waiting too long. The words settled heavily between us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I looked back down at the photograph again. My father. Alive. Smiling. One hand resting on the dog. The mountains behind him looked exactly like the ones surrounding Blackwater Ridge tonight. Like he belonged here. Like maybe I did too. Naomi stood slowly from the booth. You should get some sleep. I got questions. You'll get answers. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small brass key attached to a weathered leather tag. Stamped into the leather were faded initials. E.M. Naomi set it carefully on the table beside the photograph. That opens the supply shed behind the ranger station. What's inside? A strange look crossed her face then. Not fear exactly. Memory. Things Evelyn wanted you to find when you were ready. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains again. Ghost suddenly lifted his head sharply toward the diner windows. This time I saw it too. Far beyond town, near the tree line. Headlights, stationary, watching. Naomi followed my gaze. Her expression darkened instantly. Then she looked back at me. You need to get off the road before midnight. Why? She hesitated. Because sometimes people in mountain towns know exactly how dangerous the dark can become. Finally, she answered softly, because somebody else knows you came. The storm outside seemed to lean harder against the diner windows after she said it. I looked back toward the distant headlights near the trees. Still there, motionless, watching. Ghost stood now beneath the table, ears forward, body tense enough that I could feel the vibration of his low growl through the floorboards. Who is it? I asked. Naomi didn't answer immediately. That told me enough. In small towns, silence usually means everybody already knows the truth. They just don't want to say it out loud. She picked up the empty coffee pot and glanced toward the kitchen. You should get moving before the roads ice over completely. That didn't answer my question. No, she said quietly. It didn't. Then she leaned closer across the booth. When you get to the station, lock every door before dark. The seriousness in her eyes unsettled me more than the words themselves. I slipped the photograph and brass key carefully into my jacket pocket. Road to the station? Take Mercer Pass north out of town, 12 miles paved. After that, dirt logging road another 6. In this storm? Naomi almost smiled. Evelyn used to walk it in worse. She straightened and added one last thing before turning away. And Mason? Yeah? She waited a very long time for you to come home. Then she disappeared back behind the counter. I sat there another minute listening to the storm and trying to understand why the word home suddenly hurt so much. Ghost nudged my leg impatiently. He wanted out. I tossed cash onto the table and stood. The entire diner watched us leave. Outside, the cold hit like a slap. Snow whipped sideways across the empty street while the mountains loomed black beyond town. The headlights near the tree line vanished the moment we stepped outside. Either whoever it was had left, or they didn't want to be seen anymore. Ghost scanned the darkness carefully before jumping into the truck. I followed. The engine protested hard before finally turning over. For 1 second, I considered getting a motel room and waiting until morning. But the truth was, I didn't want to stay in town. Too many eyes. Too many questions. Too much history I didn't understand yet. So I pointed the truck north. The road climbed immediately. Snow covered the asphalt in uneven white ribbons, while the forest closed around us thicker with every mile. Blackwater Ridge disappeared behind the storm until only darkness remained in the mirrors. The higher we climbed, the quieter the world became. No headlights, no houses, no signal on my phone. Just snow, trees, and the weak yellow tunnel of my truck headlights cutting through the mountains. Ghost stayed awake beside me. Every few minutes he looked toward the woods, listening, watching. The road narrowed after Mercer Pass. Pavement became packed dirt and ice. The truck fish-tailed twice before I slowed nearly to a crawl. Tall pines crowded both sides of the logging road, their branches heavy with snow that glittered silver whenever lightning flashed above the mountains. Then the nightmares started creeping in again. Not fully awake, not fully memory. The dangerous middle place. A burst of static from the old truck radio suddenly became gunfire in my head. Snow blowing across the windshield became smoke rolling through shattered streets overseas. My hands tightened hard on the wheel. Breathe. Focus. Trees. Road. Cold air. Ghost pressed against my side instantly. Solid. Real here. I exhaled slowly. You're not letting me fall apart tonight, huh? His ears twitched. Rain turned back to snow as we climbed higher. Then finally the road ended. A rusted Forest Service gate leaned open beneath drifting snow. Beyond it stretched a narrow trail barely visible beneath the storm. A weathered wooden sign stood crooked beside the entrance. Mercer Ranger Station, 2 miles. The paint had nearly faded away. I parked the truck. Silence swallowed everything the moment the engine died. Real wilderness silence. No highway noise, no town. Just wind moving through endless pine trees somewhere in the dark. Ghost jumped out first. Snow crunched beneath his paws while he scanned the forest immediately. I grabbed my duffel bag, flashlight, and the envelope from the lawyer. Then we started walking. The trail wound uphill through dense timber. Snow reached nearly to my knees in places. Wind carried the sharp scent of pine sap and frozen earth through the darkness. Somewhere far off, water moved beneath ice. Ghost stayed several steps ahead, navigating confidently despite the storm, almost like he'd been here before. That thought sent a strange chill through me. After nearly 40 minutes, the trees finally opened, and I saw it. The ranger station sat alone above a frozen creek beneath the shadow of the mountains. Even in darkness, it looked cinematic, almost unreal. A long log cabin with a steep green metal roof half buried in snow. A stone chimney rose along one side. Beyond it stood a tall wooden fire lookout tower swaying slightly in the wind. Further back near the trees sat an old radio shack, collapsed equipment barn, weather station poles bent beneath ice stacks of firewood, covered by tarps. A single porch light glowed warmly beside the cabin door. I stopped walking. The place should have looked abandoned. Instead, it looked waiting. Ghost moved ahead slowly toward the porch. Then something strange happened. The old war dog whimpered. Not fear. Recognition. He climbed the porch steps and sat directly in front of the cabin door, like he already belonged there. Snow drifted silently across the clearing while I approached behind him. The brass key Naomi gave me fit perfectly. The lock clicked. Warm air did not greet us when I opened the door. Only cold cedar, old smoke, and silence. But the cabin itself, the cabin felt alive. Moonlight filtered through frost-covered windows onto rough wooden floors, polished smooth by decades of footsteps. Shelves lined the walls packed with books, maps, lanterns, and old Forest Service records. A heavy cast-iron stove stood near the center of the room beside neatly stacked firewood. Nothing looked abandoned. A wool blanket still rested over the rocking chair near the fireplace. A mug sat on the kitchen table beside a closed journal. A pair of reading glasses lay folded carefully beside it, like somebody had simply stepped outside for a minute. Ghost entered slowly. He sniffed once, then twice, then began moving through the cabin room by room with focused intensity. I dropped my duffel near the door and walked deeper inside. The place was bigger than I expected. A narrow hallway led toward a tiny bedroom supply room. Old communications office staircase climbing toward the loft. The walls carried framed black and white photographs. Forest fires, rescue crews, mountains, snowstorms, young rangers standing beside helicopters, and Evelyn Mercer. Always Evelyn somewhere in the pictures. Older, younger, laughing beside campfires, standing atop the lookout tower, holding radios, holding maps, holding dogs. One photograph stopped me cold. Evelyn stood beside my father on the cabin porch, and between them sat a full-grown German shepherd, identical to Ghost. Same chest marking, same scar beneath the eye. My stomach tightened. Ghost suddenly barked sharply from the main room. I turned. The dog stood frozen beside the massive stone fireplace. Every hair along his spine stood raised. He scratched once at the lower stones. Then again. Slow. Intentional. I walked toward him carefully. "What is it?" Ghost whined softly, without taking his eyes off the hearth. The stones looked ordinary enough. Old river rock fitted together decades earlier. But one section near the bottom left side appeared slightly different. Newer mortar. Cleaner edges. Recently repaired, maybe. Ghost scratched again harder this time, then suddenly stopped. His head snapped toward the windows. Outside, the storm had gone strangely quiet. Too quiet. Combat quiet. The kind of silence that usually comes right before something breaks. Then Ghost growled. Deep. Dangerous. I moved toward the front window carefully and wiped frost from the glass with my sleeve. At first I saw only snow drifting across the clearing. Then lightning flashed far above the mountains. And for half a second, I saw footprints. Fresh footprints crossing the snow behind the cabin. Not mine. Not old. Someone had been here recently. Very recently. And just beyond the tree line, something moved. Ghost exploded into motion before I could focus my eyes on it. The German shepherd lunged toward the front door with a bark so deep and violent it rattled the windows. I grabbed his harness instinctively as he strained against me, claws scraping across the wooden floor. Easy! Outside, snow whipped across the clearing hard enough to erase details almost instantly. Another flash of lightning lit the forest. Nothing there now. Only dark pines swaying in the wind. Ghost kept growling. Low. Relentless. The same sound he used overseas seconds before spotting hidden fighters buried in rubble. Every instinct in my body woke up at once. I shut off the cabin light immediately. Darkness swallowed the room except for pale moonlight leaking through the storm clouds. Ghost stood motionless beside the window listening. I listened too. At first there was only wind. Then, crunch, snow. Somewhere outside near the barn. Not an animal. Too heavy. I moved automatically. Years of SEAL training taking over before fear could settle in. My hand went to the pistol buried inside my duffel bag near the door. I hated carrying it now. Since Syria, guns felt less like protection and more like unfinished memories. But out here in the mountains, I pulled it free carefully. Ghost glanced at me once. Ready. Together we moved through the dark cabin toward the side window overlooking the collapsed barn. Another sound. Metal shifting softly. Then silence again. I cracked the window slightly. Cold air flooded inside, carrying the scent of snow and pine and something else underneath. Cigarette smoke. Fresh. Somebody had been standing out there recently. Ghost's growl deepened. Then suddenly headlights flared between the trees far below the ridge. A vehicle. Whoever had been outside was leaving. The lights vanished downhill seconds later, swallowed by the storm. I stayed frozen another full minute before finally lowering the pistol. Ghost remained tense beside me. "You saw him too," I whispered. The dog's ears stayed pinned forward. I locked every door in the cabin after that. Then I built a fire. The old wood stove caught quickly once I fed it dry cedar logs from the stack beside the hearth. Warm orange light slowly filled the room while wind rattled the windows outside. Ghost settled near the fireplace eventually, though he never fully relaxed. Neither did I. I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin pulled me awake. Every gust of wind became footsteps in my head. At one point around 3 in the morning, I woke, gripping the pistol so tightly my knuckles hurt. Ghost rested his head across my boots until my breathing slowed again. The old war dog had learned my nightmares better than I had. Morning came gray and heavy. Snow blanketed the valley nearly knee-deep beneath pale clouds hanging low over the mountains. Smoke curled from the chimney into the frozen air, while the ranger station sat alone in all that wilderness, like a forgotten outpost at the edge of the world. I stepped onto the porch with coffee steaming in my hands. The silence stunned me. No traffic. No sirens. No voices. Just wind through pine trees and the distant rush of the creek beneath the ice. Then I saw the tracks again. Fresh boot prints crossing behind the cabin toward the woods. One person. Large boots. Deep stride. Watching the station sometime during the night. Ghost sniffed the tracks carefully before staring uphill toward the trees. Whoever it was, the dog remembered the scent. That bothered me more than anything. I spent the morning repairing storm damage around the property. Physical work helped. It always had. Hammering loose boards back into place, clearing snow from the porch, rebuilding part of the fence line near the creek. Simple tasks. Real tasks. Not memories. The station slowly revealed itself while I worked. The lookout tower rose nearly 60 feet above the ridge behind the cabin, weathered gray from decades of storms. The old radio shack sat partially buried beneath snowdrifts near the tree line. Rusted weather instruments leaned crooked beside it, like skeletons frozen in place. And everywhere I looked, I found signs Evelyn Mercer had expected someone to return someday. Tools cleaned and organized, firewood stacked neatly beneath tarps, canned food still rotated by expiration date, blankets folded carefully. The place had not been abandoned. It had been preserved. For me. That realization sat strangely in my chest all day. Around noon, Ghost suddenly froze near the edge of the clearing, head high, listening. Then he bolted toward the trees. "Ghost!" The dog disappeared into the forest instantly. I took off after him. Snow crunched hard beneath my boots while branches whipped against my jacket. Ghost barked once somewhere ahead, sharp and urgent. Not danger, alert. I followed the sound downhill through dense timber until I heard voices echoing faintly through the storm. Searchers. A group of townspeople moved through the trees about 200 yards below me carrying radios and flashlights. A man in an orange winter coat spotted me first. "You see a kid up here?" "What kid?" "Boy named Owen Keller, 9 years old. Wandered off this morning." Another man pushed through the snow beside him, breathing hard. "Autistic," he explained quickly. "Gets confused easy." "How long missing?" 3 hours. The storm had worsened again while we talked. Snow fell so thick now visibility dropped to maybe 30 yards. A child alone out here wouldn't survive the night. Then Ghost barked again, deeper in the forest. Sharp, focused. The searchers turned instantly. "He's got something," I said. Without waiting, Ghost plunged uphill through the trees. I followed. The others struggled to keep pace behind us. Ghost moved fast despite the snow, nose low, weaving through the timber with absolute certainty. Every few seconds he glanced back to make sure I stayed with him. The terrain steepened sharply. Branches clawed at my face while icy wind roared through the mountains overhead. Then suddenly, the world shifted. A sound. Not real. Memory. Rotor blades. Radio static. Screaming. My chest tightened violently. For half a second, the snow-covered forest became Syria again. Smoke. Collapsed buildings. Dead civilians buried beneath concrete. I stopped moving entirely. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Ghost returned instantly. The shepherd slammed against my legs hard enough to nearly knock me backward. Solid. Warm. Real. He barked directly in my face once. Focus. Here. Now. Not there. I grabbed his harness, breathing hard while the panic slowly loosened. "Good boy," I whispered shakily. Then Ghost took off again, and I followed. 5 minutes later, we found Owen Keller. The little boy lay trapped beneath a fallen pine near the frozen creek bed. Snow covered half his body already. His lips had turned pale blue from cold, but he was alive. Ghost reached him first. The dog immediately lay across Owen's chest, shielding him from the wind, while I cleared branches away with numb hands. "It's okay, buddy," I told the boy softly. "We got you." Owen stared at Ghost instead of me, the child's shaking fingers buried into the shepherd's fur. Ghost didn't move, didn't flinch, just stayed pressed against him, keeping him warm. The search team reached us minutes later. Relief hit them so hard several nearly collapsed right there in the snow. One woman, Owen's mother probably, fell to her knees, crying the moment she saw him alive. Ghost finally stood when I lifted the boy carefully into my arms. Then I noticed it. Blood. Dark red against the white snow near Ghost's shoulder. Not much, but enough. I dropped beside him instantly. "Ghost." The dog remained standing, but his breathing had changed slightly. "Pain." I checked his fur carefully until I found the cut along his side hidden beneath the harness. Fresh, clean, knife wound, not from branches, not from the storm. Someone had cut my dog. The realization hit cold and immediate. Ghost looked back toward the trees behind us, toward the deeper wilderness beyond the creek, and for the first time since arriving in Blackwater Ridge, I understood something terrible. We weren't alone up here. Somebody else had been watching the mountain long before I arrived. Snow fell harder around the frozen creek, while Ghost stood beside me, breathing steadily through the pain in his side. Blood darkened the fur beneath his harness, in a thin line no wider than my finger, but it was enough. A knife. Somebody got close enough to stab a military dog and walk away alive. That didn't happen by accident. Owen's mother wrapped her son tightly against her chest, while the rest of the search party gathered around us beneath the trees. Their relief slowly shifted into confusion once they noticed the blood on Ghost. One of the men crouched beside the dog. What happened to him? I don't know yet. Ghost's eyes never left the forest uphill behind us, the same direction he'd been staring since the rescue, like he could still smell whoever had been there. A tall man in a sheriff's winter jacket pushed through the trees toward us, carrying a radio clipped to his shoulder. Late 40s, maybe. Broad frame, dark beard turning gray at the edges. Sheriff Elias Ward. I recognized him immediately from the badge. His eyes moved quickly. The rescued boy, the storm, Ghost's wound, then finally me. You read? Yeah. Sheriff Ward. We shook hands briefly. Firm grip, professional eyes, the kind of man who noticed more than he said. Ward crouched beside Ghost carefully. Mind if I look? Ghost allowed it after glancing at me. The sheriff pulled the fur gently apart around the cut. That's clean steel, he muttered. Not barbed wire, not tree branches. I know. Ward stood slowly. Snow gathered across the shoulders of his jacket while he looked uphill toward the dense timber. You see anybody? No. But Ghost did. The sheriff nodded once like that answer meant something to him. Then he surprised me. Your dog just saved that kid's life. I looked toward Owen. The boy sat wrapped inside his mother's coat now, but his eyes never left Ghost. Children trusted dogs faster than adults did, especially broken children. Owen suddenly slipped free from his mother and walked slowly toward us through the snow. Everybody tensed instinctively. The boy stopped directly in front of Ghost. Then very gently, he pressed one mitten-covered hand against the shepherd's neck. Ghost lowered his head. Calm. Still. No growling. No tension. Owen looked up at me quietly. He found me before the dark came. Something about the way he said it tightened my chest unexpectedly. Like Ghost hadn't simply rescued him. Like the dog had arrived exactly when the boy believed nobody would. Ward cleared his throat softly. Let's get everybody home. The hike back down the mountain felt different. The townspeople no longer looked at me like an outsider passing through. Now they looked at me carefully, curiously. Like maybe they were trying to decide if Evelyn Mercer had known something about me they didn't. Ghost walked beside me despite the wound, refusing help. Military dogs hated weakness almost as much as soldiers did. By the time we reached Blackwater Ridge, dusk had settled heavily over town. Warm lights glowed through cabin windows while smoke curled from chimneys into the cold evening air. People stood outside watching as we came in. Word had traveled already. Small towns spread stories faster than radio waves. Sheriff Ward walked beside me toward the clinic near Main Street. You staying at the ranger station tonight? That's the plan? Ward nodded thoughtfully. You see vehicles up there before today? Headlights near the tree line last night. Footprints this morning. The sheriff's expression hardened slightly. You tell anybody besides Naomi you inherited the station? The whole diner heard it. That'd do it. I looked at him sharply. You know who's been up there? Ward didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pushed open the clinic door and motioned us inside. Warm air smelled faintly of antiseptic and wood smoke. A woman in blue scrubs looked up from the front desk. Then her face softened instantly when she saw Ghost. "Oh, honey." Within minutes, the dog lay calmly on a blanket beneath bright overhead lights, while the veterinarian stitched the cut along his ribs. Ghost never made a sound. The vet shook her head quietly while working. "Most dogs would have torn my arm off by now." "He's stubborn." "He's military," she corrected gently. Like that explained everything. Maybe it did. Sheriff Ward leaned against the wall near the window, watching snow drift across Main Street outside. Finally, he spoke. "You ever hear the name Russ Vance?" "No." "You will." The sheriff folded both arms. "Vance owns mining interests south of the valley. Been trying to buy Mercer land for years." "Why?" "Lithium, mostly. Survey teams found deposits up in these mountains about a decade back." I frowned. "And Evelyn wouldn't sell?" Ward almost smiled. "Evelyn Mercer once chased 3 federal agents off her property with a shotgun because they cut down protected cedar without permission." I stared at him. "You serious?" "Dead serious." The image almost made me laugh. Almost. Ward continued quietly. "After she died, Vance assumed the property would get tied up in probate. Probably figured the land would eventually hit the market cheap. But instead it went to me." "Exactly." Snow rattled softly against the clinic windows. The sheriff lowered his voice. "Problem is, men like Russ Vance don't handle disappointment well." The veterinarian finished wrapping Ghost's side carefully. "No running for a few days," she said firmly. Ghost immediately stood up. We both ignored her together. Outside, night settled fully over Blackwater Ridge. The storm had eased slightly now, leaving the town buried beneath fresh snow glowing silver beneath the streetlights. Ghost walked close against my leg as we headed toward the truck. Then suddenly he stopped, completely still, his ears locked forward toward the far end of Main Street. A black SUV sat idling near the gas station, engine running, dark-tinted windows, watching us. Sheriff Ward noticed too. "Stay here." The sheriff crossed the street slowly through the snow toward the SUV. The vehicle pulled away immediately. Not fast, not panicked. Confident. Like it knew nobody would stop it. Ward watched the taillights disappear toward the highway before returning. "That him?" "Probably." "You got enough evidence to arrest him for stalking?" The sheriff gave me a tired look. "Mountain towns don't work like television." That answer told me everything. Ghost suddenly growled low again. This time not toward the highway, toward the sheriff. Ward noticed immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Easy, boy." But Ghost didn't relax. Interesting. The sheriff noticed that too. For one awkward second, nobody spoke. Then Ward looked at me carefully. "Your dog trust people?" "Usually." The sheriff nodded once, slowly. "Then maybe I should start worrying." Before I could ask what he meant, headlights swept across the street behind us. A heavy black pickup rolled into town pulling a long silver trailer. The vehicle stopped directly in front of the general store. Driver's side door opened. The man climbing out looked exactly like Trouble. Tall, expensive coat, gray hair slicked neatly back despite the storm, perfect leather gloves. The kind of smile rich men wear when they think the world already belongs to them. Russ Vance. Even before Sheriff Ward spoke the name, I knew. Vance looked directly at me across the snow-covered street, then at Ghost. The smile faded slightly. Interesting again. He crossed toward us calmly. "Mr. Reed," he said smoothly, "welcome to Blackwater Ridge." His voice carried expensive city confidence that didn't belong to in the mountains. I didn't offer my hand. Vance didn't seem offended. Instead, he glanced toward the dark ridge above town, where the ranger station sat hidden somewhere beneath the storm. "Beautiful property up there," he said casually. "Shame about the access roads." I stayed quiet. Men like him usually talked too much if you let silence breathe long enough. Sure enough. "I understand you inherited the Mercer station unexpectedly." "Seems that way." Vance nodded sympathetically. "That kind of responsibility can become overwhelming fast." Ghost stepped slightly in front of me. Low growl, barely audible. Vance noticed. His eyes sharpened instantly. "You know," he said softly, "I had a military dog once." That surprised me enough to break silence. "Yeah?" "Retired explosives shepherd. Mean animal." Vance smiled faintly. "Bit one of my handlers before we finally put him down." Ghost's growl deepened. Every instinct in my body tightened. There was something deeply wrong beneath the calmness in Vance's voice. Something practiced, predatory. He reached into his coat slowly and pulled out a business card. "I'd like to make you an offer for the Mercer property." "I just got here." "All the more reason to avoid getting trapped in a place like this." He handed me the card. "Russ Vance, Vance Resource Group." Then he named the number. $25,000. Even Sheriff Ward looked surprised. "That's generous for a rundown ranger station," I said carefully. Vance smiled again. "Not generous, practical." Snow drifted softly between us. Then Vance's expression changed almost imperceptibly. The friendliness disappeared. Not completely. Just enough. "You're a young man, Mr. Reed. Young men sometimes mistake mountains for peace." His eyes moved toward Ghost. "But peace doesn't usually survive up here very long." Then he turned calmly and walked back toward his truck. The entire town watched him leave in silence. Ghost's fur remained raised until the taillights disappeared down the highway. Only then did the dog finally relax. Sheriff Ward stared after the truck a long moment before speaking quietly. "You should keep your doors locked tonight." I looked toward the dark mountains above town, toward the ranger station waiting somewhere beyond the snow, then down at the business card in my hand. $25,000. Too much money for old wood and forgotten land, which meant the mountain was hiding something far more valuable. And deep down, Ghost already knew it. The drive back up the mountain felt different that night. Not peaceful. Not mysterious anymore. Tactical. The kind of quiet drive soldiers make before walking into uncertain territory. Snow crunched beneath the truck tires while darkness swallowed the logging road ahead. The heater blew weakly against the windshield, barely pushing back the cold creeping through the cab. Ghost sat upright beside me despite the stitches in his side. Watching. Always watching. Every few minutes his ears twitched toward the forest, listening for something I still couldn't hear. I kept thinking about Russ Vance, about the way Ghost reacted to him. Dogs know fear, but combat dogs know predators. There's a difference. The ranger station appeared suddenly through the trees around midnight, porch light glowing pale gold against the storm-dark clearing. For one strange second, seeing it there waiting for us stirred something unfamiliar inside me. Relief. Not because the place was safe, because it was ours. I hadn't thought like that in years. Ghost jumped from the truck before I fully parked and immediately began circling the property despite the fresh stitches pulling against his ribs. "Take it easy," I muttered. The dog ignored me completely. Military dogs only retired on paper. Inside, the cabin felt warmer than before, more lived in somehow. I added cedar logs to the stove while wind rattled the windows softly beyond the walls. The fire cracked low and orange, filling the room with the scent of smoke and old pine. Ghost paced directly to the fireplace again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Same exact stones, same exact spot. I watched him for a long moment. "You're not letting this go, huh?" The shepherd looked back at me sharply, then scratched harder. I sighed and grabbed the flashlight from my pack. The lower left section of the fireplace looked even stranger now beneath direct light. Most of the mortar between the river stones had darkened with age, except one section. Cleaner, newer, almost hidden unless you looked carefully. I crouched beside Ghost and ran my fingers along the stonework slowly. Cold, rough. Then, movement. One stone shifted slightly beneath my hand. Ghost's tail hit the floor hard once. "There it is." I grabbed the poker beside the stove and wedged it carefully between the stones. The mortar cracked softly. Dust drifted down. Then the entire section gave way inward, with a deep metallic thunk hidden behind the stonework. Not a chimney cavity. Steel. Ghost stepped back immediately, alert, focused. I pulled harder. The disguised panel slid open just enough to reveal darkness beneath the fireplace. A hidden hatch. Cold air breathed upward from below, carrying the smell of rust, dust, and something older underneath. Electronics, maybe. Oil. My pulse quickened instantly. "What the hell were you hiding up here, Evelyn?" The hatch opened fully with a scream of old hinges. A narrow metal ladder disappeared downward into darkness beneath the cabin. Ghost growled softly. Not fear. Recognition again. I grabbed the flashlight and pistol automatically. Old instincts. Never enter blind spaces unarmed. The beam cut through darkness as I climbed down slowly. Metal walls, concrete floor, old wiring running overhead. The underground room stretched far larger than I expected beneath the ranger station. Not a basement. A bunker. A real one. My boots hit concrete. Dust swirled through the flashlight beam while Ghost climbed down behind me carefully despite his injury. Then the room emerged from darkness piece by piece. Radio equipment lined one wall. Massive Cold War-era communication consoles covered in switches, dials, and faded government labels. Metal shelves stacked with weatherproof cases. Rolled military maps. Recording equipment. Old surveillance photographs pinned beneath plastic sheets. My flashlight swept slowly across faded lettering painted onto the concrete wall. U.S. Naval Intelligence Remote, Signal Division, Station, Echo Ridge. I stopped breathing for a second. Naomi had called Evelyn a ranger. Sheriff Ward called her stubborn. But this was something entirely different. Ghost moved ahead through the room, sniffing rapidly now. Focused. Purposeful. The deeper we walked, the stranger the bunker became. Photographs of mountain roads, handwritten notes, license plate numbers, radio frequencies, shipping manifests, and names. Dozens of names typed carefully onto reports. Some crossed out in red ink. Some circled. Some marked dead. A corkboard near the back wall carried maps connected by colored string like something from a federal investigation room. One name appeared repeatedly: Vance Resource Group. My stomach tightened immediately. Russ Vance. Not lithium mining, not land development. Something much bigger. Ghost suddenly barked once near the far corner of the room. I turned sharply. The dog stood beside an old steel locker half buried beneath fallen radio equipment. Its door hung slightly open. Inside sat dozens of cassette tapes carefully labeled by date. Beside them rested several thick folders wrapped in waterproof cloth, and on top, a photograph. I picked it up slowly. My father stared back at me, older than in the diner picture, thinner, harder, combat-tired. He stood beside Evelyn Mercer outside this very ranger station, wearing civilian clothes and carrying a rifle over one shoulder. On the back, written carefully in faded ink, Daniel, Winter 2010. Still trying to finish this. My chest tightened. Ghost pressed against my leg quietly. The dog remembered him somehow, or maybe bloodlines carried memory deeper than people understood. I set the photograph down carefully and opened one of the folders. Inside, shipping routes, bank transfers, cargo manifests, satellite photos, weapons trafficking, large-scale, military-grade, running through Idaho and Montana wilderness corridors for years. My flashlight trembled slightly in my hand. At the bottom of the folder sat another document stamped "Classified." I unfolded it slowly. Subject: Operation Hollow Creek. Field Agent: Daniel Reed. Status: compromised/presumed deceased. Everything inside me went cold. Not abandoned. Not missing. Not gone. My father had been working undercover, and he died doing it. Ghost suddenly moved again. The shepherd shoved his nose beneath the steel locker and began pawing aggressively at the concrete floor beneath it. Scratch, scratch, scratch. There's more? I crouched beside him. A small metal ring protruded barely above the floor, hidden beneath dust. Another compartment. I pulled hard. A square concrete panel lifted open, revealing a sealed military lockbox beneath. No combination lock. Fingerprint scanner. Old model. Dead. But taped carefully to the lid was an envelope. My name written across it. Mason Reed. My throat tightened instantly. Ghost sat beside me, completely still, waiting. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside rested a single handwritten note. Mason, if you found this, then Ghost trusted you enough to bring you here. That sentence alone stopped my heart for a second. Not you discovered this. Ghost brought you. Like Evelyn knew the dog would decide when I was ready. I kept reading. There are truths buried in these mountains powerful men would kill to keep hidden. Your father died trying to expose them. I spent 16 years protecting what he left behind. Now it belongs to you. But before you open the box, you need to understand one thing clearly. Your father never abandoned you. The bunker suddenly felt very small around me, very quiet. The fire crackling upstairs echoed faintly through the floorboards, while snowstorm wind moaned softly outside the hidden station. Ghost rested his head slowly against my shoulder, and for the first time since I arrived in Blackwater Ridge, I felt fear. Not for myself, for the truth waiting inside that lockbox. Then somewhere above us, a floorboard creaked. Ghost's head snapped upward instantly. Someone was inside the cabin. The growl that rolled from his chest sounded almost mechanical in the underground bunker. Low, controlled, deadly. I killed the flashlight immediately. Darkness swallowed us whole. Above us, another floorboard creaked softly. Slow footsteps, not hiding anymore. Ghost moved toward the ladder without waiting for commands. Every instinct in my body came alive at once. Combat mode, heart steady, breathing controlled, weapon ready. The old training slid back into place so naturally it frightened me. I shoved the envelope and photograph inside my jacket and motioned Ghost forward. The shepherd climbed the ladder silently, despite the stitches in his ribs. I followed seconds behind with my pistol raised toward the darkness above. The hidden hatch remained partially open beside the fireplace. Cold air drifted through the cabin. The fire still crackled inside the stove, but now another sound moved through the room. Drawers opening, cabinets shifting. Whoever entered was searching. Ghost froze halfway out of the hatch, waiting, listening. I heard movement near the back hallway. Then a man's voice muttered softly, "Find the damn tapes." Not alone. At least two. I eased upward slowly until I could see across the cabin floor. Flashlights swept through the darkness. Two men in winter jackets moved through the station, tossing supplies aside carelessly. One searched the desk while the other ripped books from shelves near the communications room. Neither noticed the hidden hatch behind the fireplace. Yet. Ghost glanced at me once, waiting for instruction. I held one finger up. Wait. The taller intruder moved toward the stone hearth suddenly. My pulse tightened instantly. He crouched beside the fireplace, flashlight beam moving slowly across the stones. "Boss said there was supposed to be something hidden down here." Too close. Way too close. Ghost's muscles tensed beside me. The second man kicked open another cabinet near the kitchen. Maybe the old lady already moved it. "No," the first answered. "Vance said the station was the key." Vance. Of course. The man near the fireplace reached toward the loose stones. Ghost exploded upward before I could stop him. The shepherd launched from the darkness with a roar that sounded more wolf than dog. The intruder screamed and fell backward hard, flashlights spinning across the room. Jesus Christ! The second man reached inside his jacket instantly. I moved. Years of training took over completely. I hit the floor fast, slammed the second man against the kitchen wall, and drove his wrist hard into the counter before he could fully draw the handgun. The pistol clattered away. Ghost pinned the other man beneath him, snarling inches from his throat. Nobody fired. Nobody even had time. The entire fight lasted maybe 4 seconds. The second intruder groaned beneath my arm. "You break that wrist yourself, or should I help?" "Easy! Easy!" Ghost's victim froze completely still beneath the shepherd's teeth. Fear poured off him so strongly, even I could feel it. "Call him off!" Ghost barked once directly into the man's face. The guy nearly sobbed. I kicked the dropped pistol away and dragged the second intruder upright. Both men looked local, late 30s maybe, work boots, cheap winter gear, not professionals, just hired muscle. "Who sent you?" I asked quietly. Neither answered. Ghost pressed harder against the first man's chest. That changed things quickly. "Vance," he blurted instantly. "Russ Vance. What does he want?" "We don't know." Lie. I tightened my grip on the other man's injured wrist until he gasped. "What does he want?" "The tapes." The room went silent except for the storm outside and Ghost's low growl. "Tapes of what?" "We don't know," the man repeated desperately. Vance just said the old woman hid recordings somewhere in the station. My chest tightened. The bunker. The lockbox. My father. They knew, at least partially. The taller intruder swallowed hard beneath Ghost. He said if the veteran showed up, we were supposed to scare him off before he started digging. Veteran. Not by name. Interesting. Vance didn't know exactly what I'd found yet. That gave me time. Not much, but some. I shoved the second man toward the door. Get out. Both stared at me in shock. You're just letting us go? No. I nodded toward Ghost. My dog is. Ghost slowly backed away from the taller man, but the warning in his eyes remained crystal clear. The intruders stumbled into the storm without another word. I locked the door behind them immediately, then stood there breathing hard in the silence afterward. Ghost remained near the fireplace, staring toward the woods through the windows, waiting to see if they came back. I lowered the pistol slowly. The adrenaline left me shaky afterward the way it always did now. Not during danger. After. That was the cruel part of PTSD. Your body survives the fight, then remembers everything later. I leaned both hands against the kitchen counter, trying to steady my breathing. Suddenly, Syria rushed back hard enough to blur the room around me. Smoke. Blood. A little girl screaming beneath collapsing concrete. Radio chatter begging for extraction that never came in time. My chest locked tight. Ghost crossed the cabin instantly. The shepherd shoved hard against my legs, grounding me before the panic fully swallowed me whole. I slid slowly down the cabinet to the floor beside him, breathing unevenly. It's okay, I whispered to myself more than him. Ghost pressed against my chest until the shaking eased. Outside, wind battered the ranger station, while snow buried the clearing deeper beneath darkness. Eventually, I looked down at him. You knew before I did. His ears twitched. The old dog had been warning me about this place since we arrived. Not because it was dangerous, because it mattered. I stared toward the hidden hatch behind the fireplace, then back at the envelope still tucked inside my jacket. Your father never abandoned you. The words refused to leave my head. An hour later, I climbed back down into the bunker alone while Ghost guarded the cabin upstairs. The underground room felt different now. Not abandoned anymore. Occupied by ghosts. Real ones. I sat at the old communications desk beneath flickering flashlight beams and carefully opened the lockbox at last. Inside rested military cassette tapes, old photographs, classified reports, a Navy SEAL Trident pin, and one portable tape recorder wrapped carefully in cloth. A note rested on top. Play this first. My hands shook slightly as I loaded the cassette into the recorder. For several seconds, there was only static. Then, a man's voice. Deep. Steady. Familiar in a way that hit somewhere beneath language itself. Recording log, Daniel Reed. February 17th, 2010. My throat tightened instantly. My father. Alive. His voice carried background noise. Wind. Radio static. The faint creaking of wood. Probably this very station. If this tape gets played someday, he continued quietly, then Evelyn finally decided it was safe enough. I sat motionless in the dim bunker, while Ghost paced softly above me. I don't know how old you are now, son, the voice said. Maybe still a kid. Maybe grown. Static crackled briefly. then softer. But if you're hearing this, it means you survived longer than I did. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I gripped the edge of the desk hard. Daniel Reed continued speaking calmly into the tape recorder 15 years earlier, while snowstorm wind howled faintly behind his voice. There are things buried in these mountains powerful people would kill to protect. Evelyn tried to keep me out of it. She was smarter than me. A bitter laugh. I didn't listen. More static. Then, if anything happens to me, none of this was your fault. Not yours. Not your mother's. I closed my eyes hard. My entire life I believed this man left us willingly, walked away, disappeared. But now I heard exhaustion in his voice, regret, love. I wanted to come back for you, he said quietly. God, I wanted that more than anything. The bunker blurred slightly around me. Above, the fire crackled softly upstairs inside the cabin, while Ghost moved carefully across the floorboards, standing watch. My father's voice lowered almost to a whisper. Ghost's bloodline came from my original K9 unit. Smartest dogs I ever saw. Loyal enough to follow men into hell. I laughed once under my breath despite myself. The shepherd upstairs barked softly, hearing his own name. Daniel continued, "If one of those dogs trusts you, trust him back. He'll know things before you do." My eyes burned unexpectedly. The tape hissed quietly. Then finally, "I'm sorry I couldn't get home in time, son." Silence. Long silence. And then the recording ended. I sat alone in the hidden bunker for a very long time afterward, staring into darkness while the mountains groaned beneath the winter storm overhead. Not abandoned. Not forgotten. Loved. The realization hurt worse than loneliness ever did. Because suddenly, every empty year behind me had another shape entirely. And somewhere in this station, an old woman had spent 16 years protecting the truth until I was finally ready to hear it. Then upstairs, Ghost barked sharply, not warning this time. Alarm. I grabbed the flashlight instantly, and above the storm outside, I heard engines climbing the mountain road, multiple vehicles coming fast. Ghost barked again from upstairs, sharp, urgent. I killed the tape recorder instantly and shoved the lockbox contents into a canvas field bag hanging beside the communications desk. Cassette tapes, photographs, reports, my father's recordings. Everything suddenly mattered more than my own life, because now I understood what Evelyn Mercer spent 16 years protecting. Truth, and men willing to kill for it. The engines outside grew louder through the storm. Heavy trucks climbing the mountain road hard. Too many for coincidence. Ghost barked once more, then silence. That scared me worse. I climbed the ladder fast. The cabin above glowed dimly orange from the fire while wind battered the walls hard enough to shake the windows. Ghost stood rigid at the front door, staring into darkness beyond the glass. Headlights appeared below the ridge seconds later. One pair, then another, then a third, moving through the trees toward the station. I crossed quickly to the window. 3 trucks, no markings, no sheriff lights. Russ Vance had stopped pretending. My pulse slowed instead of speeding up. Combat does that sometimes. Fear burns away once action begins. Ghost looked at me carefully, waiting. The old partnership returned instantly. No words needed. I moved fast through the cabin, shutting off every light except the stove glow. Then I grabbed supplies automatically. Flashlights, extra magazines, flare gun, hunting knife, old ranger maps hanging near the desk. The station itself became terrain in my head. Defensive points, sight lines, escape routes, the lookout tower, the barn, the creek, snowdrifts deep enough to hide movement. Ghost paced beside me, understanding everything from body language alone. Outside, engines stopped near the clearing. Doors slammed. Voices carried faintly through the storm. At least 6 men, maybe more. One flashlight beam swept across the trees near the cabin. Another moved toward the barn. Ghost growled low. "Not yet." I crouched beside the wood stove and opened the cast-iron door carefully. Flames rolled bright inside. Then I smiled for the first time in weeks. Not happiness. Recognition. Russ Vance brought hired men into a mountain storm against a SEAL trained in winter warfare. Bad decision. I moved quickly through the back hallway and climbed the narrow ladder into the loft above the main room. Old ranger equipment still filled the space. Snowshoes, signal flares, climbing rope, weather tarps. Perfect. Below, voices approached the porch. "Search everything." Vance himself, calm as ever. "The boy found something, I know he did." Another voice answered nervously. "What about the dog?" Vance paused, then quietly, "Shoot it if you have to." Ghost's ears flattened instantly. Mine probably did too. Something cold opened inside my chest. Not fear, not rage exactly. Permission. I dropped silently from the loft window onto the rear snowbank behind the station, while Ghost slipped through the side door opposite me. The storm concealed us immediately. Wind screamed through the pines while snow erased tracks almost as fast as they formed. Perfect cover. 2 armed men circled toward the back of the cabin carrying flashlights. Amateurs. Lights held too high, too wide, talking too loudly. Ghost disappeared into darkness near the creek while I moved uphill toward the trees behind the station. The first gunshot shattered the storm seconds later. One of Vance's men screamed, not hit, terrified. Ghost burst from the darkness like a black shadow and slammed the flashlight carrier into the snow before vanishing again into the blizzard. Confusion erupted instantly. "Where'd he go? Watch the trees!" Another gunshot cracked wildly into darkness. Wrong direction. I moved fast, silent through knee-deep snow. The second man never saw me until I hit him from behind near the woodshed. I drove him face first into a drift, hard enough to stun him, stripped the rifle away, and vanished back into the storm before the others could react. Chaos spread beautifully after that, exactly the way uneven terrain and fear always create. Flashlights darted wildly between trees, while the storm swallowed visibility down to almost nothing. Ghost kept moving constantly, never staying visible more than seconds. A bark from one side of the clearing, movement from another. Psychological pressure. Predators hate being hunted, especially by something they cannot see. I climbed halfway up the old lookout tower and settled behind the wooden support beams overlooking the station. From up here, I could track every flashlight below through the snowfall. Vance stood near the porch, shouting orders angrily. "They're only 2! Spread out!" Wrong again. Ghost and I were not 2. We were one working system. Always had been. One of the men moved toward the radio shack carrying a shotgun. Too isolated. Too slow. Ghost struck him from darkness near the generator shed. The shotgun blasted harmlessly into the air, while the man collapsed screaming into the snow, clutching his arm. No lethal bites. Ghost targeted tendons and weapon arms the way military dogs are trained. Disable, control, disappear. Another man panicked and fired toward movement near the barn. The muzzle flash gave away his exact position. I dropped from the tower silently and circled behind him through the storm. By the time he realized someone stood behind him, the rifle was already gone from his hands. "Go home," I told him quietly. The man stumbled backward, terrified. "I'm done! I'm done!" He ran blindly downhill through the snow. 3 left now besides Vance, maybe 4. Then everything changed. Ghost barked once near the barn. Pain. Real pain. I sprinted immediately. The storm swallowed the clearing while gunfire echoed through the trees. Another shot cracked from somewhere near the equipment shed. Then I saw him. Ghost limped from behind the barn, trailing blood across the snow. My entire world narrowed instantly. "Ghost!" The shepherd stumbled but kept moving toward me. Behind him, one of Vance's men emerged holding a hunting knife. Wrong choice. The attacker charged through the storm, shouting wildly. Training took over before thought. I sidestepped hard, caught the man's wrist, and drove him straight into the frozen barn wall. The knife disappeared into the snow, while momentum carried both of us crashing through the half-collapsed doorway. Dust exploded upward inside the dark barn. The attacker swung wildly. I blocked once, twice, then drove him backward across old lumber piles until he collapsed hard against a workbench, gasping for breath. Years ago, in another country, I might have kept going. Back then, violence solved things. Now Ghost needed me more than revenge did. I left the man wheezing on the floor and rushed back outside. Ghost stood near the barn entrance, trembling slightly. Blood soaked the fur along his shoulder and side. Knife wound reopened. Maybe worse. The shepherd still tried to stand protectively between me and the storm, despite barely holding himself upright. Something inside me broke quietly at that moment. Not weakness. Love. Pure and terrifying. I dropped into the snow beside him. "Hey," I whispered shakily. "Hey, stay with me." Ghost pressed weakly against my chest. Then headlights appeared suddenly below the ridge. Different vehicles this time. More of them. Red and blue lights flashed through the snowfall. Sheriff Ward. Behind him came more trucks. Local ranchers. Volunteer firefighters. Half the damn town by the look of it. Vance saw them too. His confidence disappeared instantly. "Move!" he shouted toward the remaining men. But it was too late. Floodlights swept across the clearing, while armed locals poured from the vehicles surrounding the station from every direction. Sheriff Ward stepped into the snow, holding a shotgun leveled directly at Russ Vance. "It's over." The storm roared around us while Vance stood frozen beside the porch. For one long second, nobody moved. Then Vance smiled slightly. Cold. Empty. "You have no idea what you just stepped into, Sheriff." Ward's expression never changed. "Maybe." More headlights climbed the ridge behind him. State police. Federal vehicles. Even through the snow, I recognized the black SUVs instantly. Someone bigger had entered the fight now. Vance finally looked uncertain. That lasted exactly 1 second. Then he ran for the trees. Gunfire did not follow. Only Ghost's growl. Low. Alive. Still protecting me despite everything. I wrapped both arms around the old war dog there in the snow, while emergency lights painted the storm red and blue across the mountains. For the first time since Syria, I wasn't fighting to survive anymore. I was fighting to protect home. That realization stayed with me while the storm slowly died over the mountain. Red and blue emergency lights flashed across the snow-covered clearing outside the ranger station, while deputies moved between vehicles collecting weapons and zip-tying the hands of the men Russ Vance abandoned behind. The valley smelled like gunpowder, wet pine, and diesel exhaust. Ghost lay beside me near the porch steps, wrapped in a wool blanket somebody had pulled from the cabin. Blood stained the white fabric dark along his shoulder. The old war dog stayed awake anyway, watching, always watching. A medic knelt beside him carefully. He should have collapsed already. "He's stubborn," I said quietly. The medic shook his head. "No, dogs like this aren't stubborn." He glanced at Ghost with visible respect. "They're loyal enough to ignore pain." Sheriff Ward approached through the snow carrying a flashlight and a stack of weatherproof evidence bags. "You okay?" "Been worse." Ward looked around the clearing. Broken footprints, shell casings, blood in the snow. The burned orange glow from the cabin windows behind us. "You fight like somebody who's done this before." I stared toward the dark tree line where Russ Vance disappeared. "I was trained to." The sheriff nodded once. No judgment in it, just understanding. Around us, the people of Blackwater Ridge kept arriving despite the late hour and freezing cold. Ranchers, volunteer firefighters, older couples wrapped in heavy winter coats. Even Naomi from the diner came climbing out of a truck, carrying 2 thermoses and enough blankets for half the mountain. Nobody told them to come. They came anyway. That unsettled me more than the gunfight had, because I didn't know what to do with kindness anymore. Naomi crouched beside Ghost slowly. The shepherd sniffed her hand once before resting his head back onto the blanket. "Well," she whispered softly, "you handsome old devil." Ghost's tail thumped weakly against the snow. Naomi looked at me then. "You look exactly like your father when you're trying not to fall apart." The words hit harder than expected. I looked away toward the mountains. Federal agents entered the ranger station shortly before dawn. Real federal agents, not local police. Dark jackets marked Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS. One of them emerged from the hidden bunker 2 hours later, carrying sealed evidence boxes while talking urgently into a satellite phone. Sheriff Ward joined me near the fire barrel outside. "They confirmed the bunker belonged to a Cold War listening operation," he said quietly. "And my father?" Ward hesitated. "They found his personnel records inside." The sheriff handed me a worn photograph sealed inside plastic evidence wrap. Daniel Reed stood beside Evelyn Mercer outside the lookout tower, smiling into mountain sunlight. Beside them sat another German shepherd wearing an old military harness. The dog looked almost identical to Ghost. My chest tightened again. "Your father was investigating weapons trafficking routes through the Bitterroots," Ward continued. "Looks like Vance's family operation got tangled up in it years ago." "Tangled up?" Ward exhaled slowly into the freezing air. "More like built on it." The mountains behind him slowly brightened beneath approaching sunrise. For the first time, I saw the valley clearly in daylight, and it took my breath away. The ranger station sat high above endless pine forests, dusted silver beneath fresh snow. The frozen creek cut through the valley like broken glass, while mountains rose layer after layer into pale morning sky. Wild, beautiful, lonely. Home. Ghost stirred beside the porch. The veterinarian arrived shortly after sunrise and immediately took control of the cabin like an annoyed field commander. "You," she pointed at me, "move." I obeyed automatically. Apparently, surviving combat didn't prepare men for older women with medical authority. She examined Ghost carefully while I paced near the stove, trying not to panic. The knife reopened his earlier wound and cut deeper this time. Not fatal, but close enough to scare me badly. Ghost watched me pace with tired eyes. "You stay still for 5 minutes," I muttered. The dog ignored me. Again. Outside, the station slowly transformed into something unexpected. Community. People shoveled snow from pathways. Firefighters repaired storm damage near the barn. 2 older ranchers reinforced the porch rail without being asked. Someone stacked fresh firewood beside the cabin. Nobody acted like visitors. They acted like protectors. Like the mountain itself belonged to all of them. Naomi handed me coffee around mid-morning. Strong. Black. Perfect. "You know what Evelyn used to say about this valley?" she asked. I shook my head. She said mountains don't care who arrives broken. Naomi smiled faintly. Only whether they stay long enough to heal. I stared out the window toward the lookout tower rising above the ridge. I don't know how to stay anywhere. Yes, you do. She nodded toward Ghost. You already did. That one hurt. Because she was right. Ghost had been the only constant left after the military chewed through the rest of my life. Deployments, hospitals, funerals, shelters, truck stops. The dog stayed through all of it. And somehow now, this town was trying to do the same thing. By afternoon, Sheriff Ward gathered everyone near the porch. Snow still drifted lightly through the trees, while the valley settled into quiet after the violence of the night before. Ward removed his gloves slowly. We recovered enough evidence from the station to open a federal investigation into Russ Vance and Vance Resource Group. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Trafficking, Ward continued. Weapons, illegal transport routes, bribery. One rancher spat into the snow. Knew that bastard was rotten. The sheriff nodded. Federal warrants are already moving. Then his eyes shifted toward me. And none of this would have happened without Mason Reed and his dog. Suddenly everybody looked at me. I hated that instantly. Attention always felt dangerous after the military. Too many eyes usually meant somebody was about to die. But these eyes looked different. Warm. Proud somehow. Owen Keller suddenly stepped out from beside his mother and crossed the snow toward Ghost. The little boy knelt carefully beside the shepherd and placed something beside him, a small, carved wooden wolf, probably handmade. For protecting me, Owen whispered. Ghost sniffed it gently, then rested his chin beside the carving like it was treasure. Several people quietly wiped tears after that. I looked away, pretending not to notice. Naomi absolutely noticed. She handed me another coffee without saying a word. Late that afternoon, while the town still moved around the station repairing damage, Naomi finally told me the truth she'd been carrying since the beginning. We stood near the edge of the ridge overlooking the valley, while smoke curled from the cabin chimney behind us. She watched you, you know. I frowned. Who? Evelyn. The cold wind shifted softly through the pines. Naomi folded both arms against her coat. Every year on your birthday, she drove to Missoula. The world suddenly felt very still. What? She'd park across from your school when you were younger. Later, she watched football games. Then your military graduation. Naomi smiled sadly. One year, she sat outside a grocery store for 3 hours just to see you walk out carrying dog food. I couldn't speak. She wanted to tell you the truth every single time, Naomi continued quietly, but she thought showing up suddenly might destroy whatever life you were trying to build. A painful laugh escaped me before I could stop it. What life? Naomi looked at me carefully. She didn't know about the homelessness until later. I stared out toward the endless mountains swallowing the horizon. All those years, she loved you from a distance because she thought it was safer. My throat tightened painfully. No one had ever stayed long enough to love me carefully before. That kind of love felt almost unbearable. Naomi touched my shoulder gently. She was waiting for the right moment to bring you home. The sun dropped lower behind the mountains, turning the snowfields gold. Somewhere behind us, Ghost barked softly from the porch. Alive. Still here. I wiped my face quickly before Naomi could see too much. Too late. Older women see everything. She left one more thing for you, Naomi said quietly. What? She nodded toward the lookout tower. At the top. I looked up toward the weathered structure rising above the ridge. The tower swayed slightly against the evening sky, while wind moved through its old wooden beams. Waiting. Just like the station had waited. Just like Evelyn Mercer had waited. And for the first time in a very long time, I stopped feeling like a man passing through somebody else's life. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Blackwater Ridge after that. Not all at once. Mountain winters never leave politely. Snow still covered most of the valley through March, but sunlight lingered longer each evening, and water began running beneath the ice along the creek below the station. The mountains changed color too. Dark blue mornings softened into silver afternoons. The first ravens returned to the high thermals above the ridge, and somehow, against every instinct I had left, I stayed. Federal investigators came and went for weeks after the attack. Black SUVs climbed the logging road almost daily, collecting evidence from the bunker beneath the station. The hidden files Evelyn Mercer protected for 16 years cracked open something much larger than Russ Vance. Weapons trafficking, smuggling routes through Idaho and Montana wilderness corridors, corrupt contracts reaching back decades. Men in expensive suits started disappearing from newspapers shortly after. Then one cold morning in late March, Sheriff Ward arrived carrying fresh copies of the Missoula paper beneath his arm. Thought you should see this. I sat on the porch wrapped in my father's old wool coat, while Ghost rested beside my boots beneath a patch of weak sunlight. The sheriff handed me the newspaper. Russ Vance disbarred from corporate board, federal charges filed. Below the headline sat a photograph of Vance being escorted into a courthouse surrounded by federal agents. For a long moment, I just stared at it. All that money, all that power. And in the end, it was an old woman in a mountain ranger station who brought him down. Sheriff Ward leaned against the porch railing beside me. Your grandmother was tougher than most men I ever met. I smiled faintly. She wasn't my grandmother. Ward glanced sideways. No? I looked out toward the mountains. She was something better. The sheriff nodded quietly, like he understood exactly what I meant. Ghost stirred beside me, slower now than before. That worried me. The knife wound healed badly despite the veterinarian's care. Infection settled deep beneath the stitches during the weeks after the attack. Some mornings Ghost could barely climb the porch stairs without stopping halfway. But the old dog still followed me everywhere. Always. Even when his body started failing him. Especially then. By April, I began repairing the lookout tower. Maybe because Naomi said Evelyn left something for me there. Maybe because I needed a mission again. Or maybe because soldiers understand broken structures instinctively. One board at a time. One weakness repaired before collapse spreads. The tower rose above the valley like an old skeleton against the spring sky. 60 feet of weathered timber and rusted bolts swaying gently whenever mountain wind crossed the ridge. Ghosts sat beneath it every day while I worked, watching, guarding, sometimes sleeping beneath the sunlight for hours at a time. The town kept showing up too. Naomi brought groceries every Sunday. Owen Keller visited after school carrying carved wooden animals he left beside Ghost like tiny offerings. Volunteer firefighters helped rebuild the collapsed barn. Even Sheriff Ward came twice with lumber and pretended not to enjoy himself while hammering support beams into place. A community formed around me so quietly I barely noticed it happening. Until one evening, I realized something terrifying. I knew everybody's names. That had not happened anywhere since before the military. One afternoon in early May, while replacing old tower windows, I found the carving Naomi mentioned. It sat beneath the eastern lookout window, weathered soft by decades of wind and snow. I brushed dust away carefully. The words cut deep into the wood grain read, "For the Reed men who survive long enough to come home." My throat tightened instantly. Below the carving sat 2 older names scratched faintly beneath Evelyn's handwriting. Daniel Reed. Mason Reed. I stared at my own name for a long time. Evelyn carved it years before I ever arrived, like she never doubted I would eventually find my way here. Even after everything. Even after homelessness, war, PTSD, loss. She believed I would survive long enough to come home. The thought nearly broke me. Ghost barked weakly below the tower. I climbed down quickly. The shepherd stood near the edge of the ridge looking toward the valley, but something was wrong. His breathing had changed. Shallow, uneven. Fear hit me instantly. Ghost? The dog tried to walk toward me and stumbled. Every ounce of blood drained from my face. No. I dropped beside him in the grass. Ghost's body trembled beneath my hands while his eyes searched for me through obvious pain. Not again. Please, not again. I carried him to the truck myself. The old dog weighed less now than he used to. That scared me almost worse than the collapse. The drive into town blurred completely. Spring rain hammered the windshield while my hands shook hard on the wheel. The clinic lights glowed warm against the darkening evening when we arrived. The veterinarian met us at the door, already pulling on gloves. Inside. Now. Hours passed after that. Silent, terrible hours. I sat on the clinic floor outside the treatment room with blood dried across my sleeves while rain tapped softly against the windows. Naomi arrived first, then Sheriff Ward, then Owen's mother carrying coffee I never drank. Nobody asked me to leave. Nobody told me to calm down. They just stayed. That alone almost undid me. Around midnight, the veterinarian finally stepped out. Her face told me everything before she spoke. Infection spread faster than we thought. I couldn't breathe for a second. He's old, Mason. I looked through the small glass window into the treatment room, where Ghost lay beneath warm blankets connected to IV lines and monitors. Small. Fragile. Nothing like the unstoppable war dog who dragged me through half my nightmares. He stayed alive this long because he wanted to, the vet continued softly, not because his body should have allowed it. I lowered my head into my hands. The room tilted slightly. Not now. Please, not him too. Naomi sat beside me quietly. No speeches, no fake comfort. Just presence. That mattered more. 3 days passed like that. 3 days beside Ghost. I barely left the clinic floor except when the nurses forced coffee into my hands, or Naomi dragged me outside for air. At night, I slept beside the dog on blankets near his bed. Every time I woke, Ghost was still watching me, even exhausted, even hurting, still guarding me. On the third night, a thunderstorm rolled through the valley. Rain hammered the roof while lightning flashed blue against the windows. I sat beside Ghost, holding one scarred paw between both hands. "You can rest," I whispered finally. The words almost killed me to say. "You already got me home." Ghost's breathing slowed softly beneath the storm sounds. Then very carefully, the old shepherd lifted his head, his nose pressed weakly against my chest the way he used to during panic attacks, grounding me one last time. And then, his tail moved once, the smallest movement, but enough. The monitor beside him steadied slightly. The veterinarian looked up sharply from across the room. "Well," she whispered, "looks like he's not finished with you yet." I laughed once through tears I couldn't stop anymore. Outside, thunder rolled away through the mountains, and for the first time since I came to Blackwater Ridge, I understood something Evelyn Mercer had known all along. Healing does not happen because pain disappears. It happens because somebody stays long enough to help carry it. Spring arrived slowly in the Bitterroot Mountains after that storm. Snow melted first along the southern ridges where sunlight lingered longest. The frozen creek beneath the ranger station cracked open into rushing silver water, loud enough some mornings to wake me before sunrise. Wildflowers pushed through the thawing earth in scattered patches across the valley. Purple lupine, Indian paintbrush, glacier lilies glowing pale gold beneath the pines. And every morning, Ghost and I watched the mountains wake back up together. The old shepherd survived. Barely. The infection left him thinner and slower than before, but alive. His muzzle had gone almost completely gray now, and some mornings his back legs shook slightly when he climbed the porch stairs. But he was still here. That mattered more than anything else. By June, the ranger station no longer looked abandoned. Fresh timber lined the repaired barn. New glass reflected sunlight from the restored lookout tower. Smoke rose daily from the chimney. Life had returned to the mountain. And somehow, so had I. The online forestry courses started that same month. University of Idaho. Never thought I'd say those words in my life. The first time I logged into class from the old ranger desk beneath Evelyn's maps, I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. 6 months earlier, I'd been sleeping in a dying pickup truck outside a truck stop near Missoula. Now I was studying watershed management, while a retired military dog snored beside a Cold War bunker hidden beneath my floorboards. Life changes strangely sometimes. The town kept climbing the mountain too. Naomi every Sunday with groceries and stories. Sheriff Ward pretending he needed help repairing fences when really he just wanted coffee on the porch. Owen bringing ghost-carved wooden animals almost every week now. The old dog collected them beside his blanket like trophies. One evening in late June, Naomi arrived carrying a small cardboard box wrapped carefully in twine. I found this while helping sort Evelyn's storage shed. Inside rested dozens of old letters bundled neatly together. Not government reports, not military records. Letters addressed to me. Every birthday, every Christmas, Every year of my life. My throat tightened instantly. She kept copies of every one, Naomi whispered. I spent weeks reading them, slowly, one at a time. Evelyn wrote about weather, mountains, books, and birds nesting near the lookout tower. She described sunsets over the Bitterroots and storms rolling through the valley in language so vivid I could almost hear her voice speaking aloud. But mostly, she wrote about waiting for the day I might finally come home. One letter stopped me completely. Written the year I enlisted. Mason, if you ever choose the military, remember something men often forget. Surviving is not the same thing as living. Come home before the war convinces you otherwise. I had to set the letter down after that, because the war had convinced me otherwise. For years. Until now. July brought warmer nights and green valleys stretching endlessly beneath the mountains. The ranger station became something unexpected by then. Not just home. Purpose. Veterans started arriving quietly after Sheriff Ward mentioned the station to an outreach counselor in Missoula. At first only one or two, men sleeping in trucks, women carrying trauma in their eyes, former soldiers who looked exactly like I used to look. Ghost greeted every single one gently, like he recognized them. Maybe he did. We started hiking the trails together, fishing the creek, repairing fences, talking when somebody needed to, sitting quietly when they didn't. The mountains did most of the healing themselves. I just gave people a place to arrive. By August, folks around Blackwater Ridge had started calling the ranger station Mercer House. Nobody asked my permission. The name simply stuck. And every time I heard it, I pictured Evelyn smiling somewhere beyond the trees. One cool September morning, nearly a year after I first arrived, I finally climbed the lookout tower again. Not to repair it this time, just to sit. Ghost followed slowly beside me despite the steep stairs. The tower swayed gently beneath us, while mountain wind moved through the beams exactly the way my father described in his recordings. At the top, the world opened completely. Endless forest, blue mountain layers fading into the horizon. No highways, no cities, no noise except wind. Ghost settled beside the eastern window, while I stood there staring across 80 miles of wilderness, glowing gold beneath early autumn sunlight. And suddenly I understood why Evelyn stayed here 40 years. The mountains didn't erase pain. They simply reminded you how small pain becomes compared to time. I rested one hand against the old carved message beneath the window. For the reed men who survive long enough to come home. Then beneath it, using my father's old hunting knife, I added 4 new words carefully into the wood. We finally made it. Ghost leaned against my leg quietly. The old dog's breathing had grown slower lately, gentler, like he finally trusted the world enough to rest. We stayed in the tower until sunset. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us needed to. That night, after the town's harvest festival ended and the valley settled into darkness, I sat alone on the porch with 2 cups of coffee steaming in the cold mountain air. 1 cup beside me. 1 cup sitting untouched near the railing. For Evelyn. For my father. The stars above the Bitterroots looked endless. Ghost rested near my boots, watching fireflies drift through the meadow below the station. I looked down at the pistol sitting beside my chair. The same pistol I carried since leaving the military. The same one I slept beside every night, because some part of me believed danger was always coming. Slowly, I picked it up, turned the safety on, and carried it inside the cabin. When I came back out, my hands felt strangely lighter. Ghost watched me carefully. Then, for the first time in years, the old shepherd relaxed completely. No scanning the darkness. No listening for threats. Just peace. I sat beside him until sunrise touched the mountain's pale gold. And somewhere in the wind, moving through the pines, I could almost hear Evelyn Mercer's voice again. Not sad, not distant. Home. The truth is, I came to Blackwater Ridge believing I inherited a piece of land. I was wrong. What Evelyn Mercer really left behind was refuge, a place where wounded people could arrive without shame, a place where soldiers could stop running long enough to remember who they were before survival became their whole identity. She built that place quietly for decades, waiting for somebody to continue it. Waiting for me. And maybe that's the real miracle of life. Not money, not justice, not even survival. Maybe the miracle is simply this. Sometimes love waits for us longer than we deserve. Sometimes home keeps the light on long after we stop believing we'll ever return. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, there's still an old dog beside us when we finally get there. Ghost lifted his head slowly as sunlight spilled across the porch. I scratched behind his ears the way my father probably once scratched behind another shepherd's ears years ago beneath these same mountains. "Morning, partner," I whispered. The old war dog closed his eyes peacefully. And for the first time since I was a child, I truly believed the fighting was over. If you believe loyalty still matters in this world, comment yes down below and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Sometimes the people and dogs who stand beside us through the worst storms become the reason we finally find our way home. And if stories about courage, justice, and good people protecting what matters mean something to you, subscribe and come sit by the fire with us again soon.